this partnership. I think it's the first time Revolving Doors Agency has been involved in a transatlantic partnership as well. So we're kind of handing over to our colleagues. And I think, Brendan, you're over in New York, and Naja, you're over in Minneapolis, and I can let you do your own introductions. But Naja, I'm gonna hand over to you, I think, to get us going with the presentation. And Brendan, I believe you're going to be putting up the presentation so others can see it too. And welcome.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for being here. We are one shy of triple digits. This is wonderful. My name is Naja Morris, and I am located in Minneapolis, Minnesota, upper Midwest area of the United States. I have been with the National Support Bureau for about 3.5 years now, and I'm currently the director. I began my experience with LEAD in Seattle, Washington as a case manager with the pilot program. First ever LEAD program in all of the world. Started in Seattle, Washington, which is where I call my home. I then, after that, subsequently became a LEAD supervisor. So I supervise the direct service workers. We call them case managers in Seattle. They go by other names such as support specialists, care navigators, and other words that tend to be very supportive and encouraging of building relationships and strong partnerships. I will go ahead and kick it over to my colleague, Brendan Cox, to introduce himself, and then we will get going on today's training.
Thanks, Naja. It's great to be here. So I'm Brendan Cox. I'm the Director of Policing Strategies for the LEAD National Support Bureau, and I've been with the Bureau since January 2017. And prior to being with the Bureau, I was with the Albany, New York Police Department. Albany is the capital of New York State. We're about 150 miles north of New York City. And I was with the Albany Police Department for 23 years, and we were the third police department in the country to implement LEAD. We got ultimately started in 2016. And when I retired from the police department, I was the chief. So it's a pleasure to be with everybody today, and look forward to talking to everybody about how we can ultimately help you guys out. We're really excited about this project. So I'm going to kick things back to Naja, and we will get started off.
Yes. So the LEAD National Support Bureau is made up of myself and Brendan, as well as our boss, Lisa Dugard, who's actually what we call the godmother of LEAD. She is the woman who developed LEAD along with a couple other folks in Seattle back in 2011. And we are responsible for going around the country and the world, apparently, to train folks in how to do LEAD. We help give people a deeper understanding about what LEAD is, how it works, how to launch it, how to support funding dollars for it, and how to keep a pilot project going and sustained, and eventually, hopefully, help it to grow. We are a project of the Public Defender Association, which is located in Seattle, Washington, the home of LEAD. Public Defender Association used to do public defense, but no longer does. We're actually in the process of changing our name now, because what we are is a program or a project association that does various criminal justice reform and civil rights programs. So we have about 6 to 8 programs now, including LEAD, that are held at the Public Defender Association. We are based, we're based in Seattle. One of our staff is in Seattle. I'm in Minneapolis, and then Brendan is in Albany, New York. We also contract with other experts. So at times when we are doing trainings and providing TA around the country, we will ask experts to come in to support in various areas. So we might have someone come in from anywhere in the country or maybe even the world to talk with folks, talk with the solicitors about what their role would be, talk to law enforcement about their role would be. We were established, the Bureau itself was established in 2016 because of a need to respond to jurisdictions that were developing LEAD initiatives across the country and internationally. So the LEAD National Support Bureau kind of happened by accident. What happened was when LEAD launched in Seattle in 2011, October, by early 2013, we started to receive calls from all around the country because of media coverage. They were asking us, what are you doing? This looks so cool. This is really outstanding. This is something we've never seen. Can we come visit? So many people began visiting, and then people began asking us, can you teach us how to do this thing? So after about a year or so, a year and a half of that, we realized that we had to build capacity to be able to respond to these support requests. And so that's how the Lead National Support Bureau began. And we have grown and grown, and you will see a map at the end of this presentation. But we are now in about 60 plus sites around the country, with plans in another maybe 2 to 4 sites, including there in the UK, around the world. And we are growing every day. We expect to roll out another 10 to 15 sites over the next year or so. I said we provide technical assistance and training, and that's what we focus on. We don't, just to be clear, we don't actually run or oversee or supervise any other site besides the sites. The PDA, Public Defender Association, does provide the site support and project management, and you'll hear more about that later, to the Seattle site and the Washington State site. But we aren't actually responsible for the development and the running and all of the programmatic details and supervision of sites around the country. We just provide the technical assistance, training, and support. Thanks, Brendan.
No problem. Thanks, Naja.
Yes.
So I'll jump in and give some of the background on how LEAD started. And so I think folks know this for the most part, but the United States is not shy when it comes to using punitive factors to try to stop people from doing certain things, especially when it comes to drugs. We're kind of the leader in the world about using incarceration to try to stop people from using drugs. And this was very true in the 80s and 90s, and to a certain extent today. And that certainly created many disparities, racial disparities in the criminal legal system. And that was very true in Seattle. So in Seattle in the late 80s and early 90s, in a neighborhood called the Belltown neighborhood, which is a very famous touristy area. It's where the Pike Fish Market is. It's where, if you ever see any of the tourist commercials for Seattle, it's where they always show and highlight. It was very much an open air drug market. So there were folks selling drugs, folks using drugs in the open. There was some sex work happening there, and the Seattle Police Department was getting a lot of complaints about that open air drug market. And back at that time, there was really one avenue for the police department to use, and that was to arrest folks. So they were arresting folks in waves. They were arresting a lot of folks, and they weren't really seeing any changes. Certainly that was true for across the country as well. They were arresting a lot of the same people over and over again, and they were not seeing any kind of improvement. Because what was happening in the system is that the system was clogged up with mass arrests, and district attorneys, who are ultimately the prosecutors in the United States, the district attorney in that county had limited resources. So only certain cases were actually being filed, only certain cases were actually going forward in the process. So people were getting right out. So people would get arrested, they would go before a judge, they would get released, and they would go right back to the same behavior. So the police department was frustrated. The community was frustrated, and people were not exactly happy with what was happening. But there was a whole nother group of folks that were also frustrated, and those were folks on the civil rights end of things, because what they saw was that there was this huge racial disparity that existed in the system, in the fact that the city of Seattle was about 8% African American, yet the percentages of folks that were being arrested in that Belltown neighborhood were about 65% African American. So there was this huge disparity that existed by that racial output that was happening. And this certainly would be true anywhere you looked in the United States. We see those disparities happening, and yet we know that folks that use drugs, there's no disparity in who uses drugs when it comes to race. So in the United States, there's what we call patterns and practices, where many times that there'll be suits that lawsuits that come against cities and police departments for their patterns and practices that are being racially disparate. And that's what happened. There wound up being some lawsuits against the police department for the patterns and practices of the department being in and of themselves racially disparate. And while part of that process was happening, there's what's called mediation. Folks from the police department were on one side of the table, and folks from the civil rights side were on the other side, including our boss, Lisa Dugard, trying to basically mediate and work out a solution. And the captain from the narcotics unit of the Seattle Police Department, Captain Brown, looked across the table and said, you know what, for the sake of argument, instead of continuing this debate, let's just say that our patterns and practices are racially disparate. We have one tool, and that's to arrest people. We have people violating the law, we get complaints about it, and we have this one tool, that's to arrest people. If you all could tell us what to do, if you have a better solution, you know, what is it? You know, we're open, tell us what we should do differently. And he was being honest, he was not being sarcastic, as some folks might imagine a police officer might be to the civil rights folks. And the civil rights folks were honest back, and they said, you know, we really don't have an answer for you about what you should do. We just know that the status quo is not appropriate. And both sides said that. The status quo is not appropriate. We're not seeing any improvements. And what we see is wrong. So both sides said, you know what, let's actually stop being on opposite sides of the table, and let's actually see if we could come up with a solution. So let's work together to see if we could make the arrest be the last resort for drug offenses. And let's see if we could give officers a new alternative to arrest. And let's see if that could actually yield better outcomes for everybody that's involved, because we realize that we have a bunch of folks that are persistent offenders that have unmet behavioral health needs, and they're getting arrested over and over again, and we're expecting different results. And for anybody that knows the definition of insanity, that's actually it. When we do the same thing over and over again and think we're going to get a different result. So what the folks did is they actually came up with LEAD, and they launched it as a pilot in 2011 in that Belltown neighborhood. And they made it a pre-arrest, pre-booking diversion initiative. And what I mean by that is that they decided that ultimately, instead of doing this after an arrest happens, instead of doing this when it gets before a judge and we get all kinds of people involved, they determined, let's do this at a point when the officer comes across somebody, they've committed a crime, and rather than wait until this gets further into the system, let's give that officer that opportunity to say right then and there that, hey, I'm going to offer you some help. And instead of arresting you tonight, I'm going to offer you a case manager. And we're going to go ahead and we're going to get that case manager to the scene, and we're going to do what we call a warm handoff. And when we do that warm handoff, that case manager is going to start working with you right away. And Najee is going to really go into case management in a little bit, but that case manager is going to start working with you right away to really build a relationship and really start to try to determine what it is. What's the root cause that's causing you to commit crimes? What's the root cause that's going on that's creating a situation where you need to commit crimes to ultimately survive? What you need to do to ultimately deal with the situations you have. Because we know that there are a bunch of people with unmet behavioral health needs. There's a bunch of folks that are living in poverty. We have a lot of folks in the United States that are homeless. And folks are committing crimes because they're trying to survive. They're trying to figure out how they're going to get to the next point. And we also have a lot of people with substance use disorders. And we have folks that are committing those crimes to deal with taking care of that addiction. And we know that through arrest is not going to solve the problem. And we have the perfect example here in the United States with the fact that between 1980 and 1994, we increased our incarceration rate for nonviolent drug offenses by 700%. So we went from about 40,000 to about 400,000 people that we incarcerated for nonviolent drug offenses. And of course, anybody that thinks about incarceration, yes, we're trying to rehabilitate the offender, the person that commits the crime, and we could debate rehabilitation all day about whether or not jail and prison does that. But it's supposed to also be to really send a message to the other folks about trying to get other folks to not commit crimes. So we would think that if we increased incarceration by 700% in the United States for nonviolent drug offenses, that we would actually cause the drug rate use to go down, that we would have fewer people using drugs throughout our country in that same time frame. But instead, what we saw is that we saw an increase in the folks that were using drugs. So we know that punitive fashions did not work. So what LEAD does is LEAD looks to see through a collective process if we can change the way we do things. So I'm going to come back to this slide in a moment. I'm going to jump ahead two slides. So what LEAD does is LEAD takes that arrestable offense for that officer and it gives them an alternative. So it allows them to say, I have this individual that's committed this crime. This crime is ultimately driven by an unmet behavioral health need, usually a substance use disorder or a mental health issue, or they're living in poverty or homeless. And instead of making that arrest, I'm going to divert them, and I'm going to bring that case manager to the scene. That case manager is going to start working with that individual right away. And in the case of an arrest diversion, the only thing we're going to ask the person to do is we're going to ask them to do two things. One, they're going to sign a release of information, and I'm going to get to why that is in a moment. And the other thing we're going to have them do is we're just going to have them do an intake. And that intake is really going to drive what we're going to do with that individual. And that's going to be their case management plan. And that ultimately is going to keep that case from ever being filed. That's going to keep that case from ever being, that person from ever being charged for that crime. So that's going to be an arrest diversion. But we're also going to recognize that we don't always need to wait until somebody commits a crime. That we know the folks, that our officers also know the folks that are out and about that are committing crimes, especially crimes that are driven by that unmet behavioral health needs. So we have officers out there that can also make what we call a social contact referral. And that social contact referral happens when officers know individuals that are out there that need those services, that they don't wait until the next time they commit a crime. So they can turn, if they know me and they know that I've been committing crimes that are based on those unmet behavioral health needs, that they can refer me into the system. So they can give Naja a call, who's the case manager, and say, Naja, I have Brendan Cox. I've arrested him 15 times before. He's got some issues going on. I'd like to get him into lead. Can you meet me? We're going to go talk to him. We're going to offer him those services. So ultimately, that we can get me in and make sure that we stop me before I commit the next crime. So that way we can get me into services. So that is the second way that we are able to get me in. So I'm going to back up now and talk about the collective management of lead, because ultimately, and I apologize for skipping around a little bit, because ultimately, when we talk about the fact that we have the opportunity to divert folks away, we need to figure out how it is that lead operates. And we want to talk about two very important things. So the way lead operates is there's a policy coordinating group. And the policy coordinating group is the stakeholders that bring the resources to bear. So it's the folks that can say, I can staff personnel and I can bring financial resources to bear, and these are the things we're going to do, and this is how we're going to do it. So in the United States, that's many times police chiefs, sheriffs, mayors, county executives, prosecuting attorneys, public defenders, folks that can ultimately make those decisions and bring those resources. We also try to include civil rights groups, community-based organizations, folks that can ultimately also not only bring resources, but also help represent our community members and have a say and ultimately be able to make connections back to the community, so that way the folks that we're ultimately trying to serve have a voice as well. And then ultimately there's what we call an operation work group. And that operation work group are the folks that are on the ground actually doing the work. So that's the project manager who oversees the day-to-day operations. Usually the policy coordinating group will hire an agency to do that project management. Then the police officers that are making the diversions, the managers who are working with the participants, usually a representative of the prosecuting attorney's office, because folks have old cases and sometimes wind up ultimately having a new case, somebody from the public defender's office, and they're a group that meets usually every other week, and they do a problem-solving session. So let me back up to that arrest diversion. So when somebody is ultimately diverted from arrest and brought in as a participant and lead, that operations work group will meet every other week, and folks will talk about how that individual is doing. So when I get diverted from an arrest charge, and Naja is my case manager, Naja will come into the operation work group meeting and tell the folks, I've met with Brendan, here's what we've started to work on. He's identified that he needs identification because we need to get him back on social services. He's got some medical issues we need to start working on. He's talked about some treatment, but he's not ready for that yet. So we're going to start doing some other stuff. So Naja will give an update on how I'm doing. Naja will also have a chance to really talk to the officers who might have diverted me, and they might be able to have some more background information on me because they might know me and know me really well or know my family. So there'll be an opportunity to share information. And that's really a great problem-solving session where the folks that get in the room recognize that they're there to certainly learn information about what's happening, but they're really more there to make sure that they're bringing the support for our participants, because there's the recognition that the more support we have for our participants, the better off our participants are, the more likely they are to improve. And when the life and likelihood of success of our participants is increased, then actually the more likely it is that our public safety is going to increase. And ultimately, that group is what the glue is of LEAD. So Naj is going to talk about case management momentarily. And I want to touch on this because I know that ultimately in the poll, we talked about harm reduction. Naj is much more of the expert than I am on this, but I want to touch on this because of the fact that when we come from law enforcement, this is really counterintuitive. So when folks in LEAD started to figure out the process of what that case management philosophy was going to be, it was determined to be harm reduction. And harm reduction is really a philosophical intervention that comes from the public health background. And it's really about reducing harms associated with behaviors. And this was really originally about drug use, but it really blossoms into a ton of other things. And it's really about meeting people where they're at, but not leaving them there. And that's figuratively and literally. So for us, that means if somebody's living under a bridge, that's where the case manager goes to meet them. And if somebody's using drugs, but they're not ready to stop, we're going to accept that, but we're going to start working with them to figure out what other key things that person needs. And we're going to recognize that change takes time. Not everybody's ready, willing, or able to make large changes. And if we make incremental changes, that ultimately we will have more long-lasting changes as we move down the road. So we recognize that the long-term behavior change is going to take a certain amount of time to happen. And until we really build a relationship with that person, we're not going to be able to get a lot of those major accomplishments made. Because let's face it, if somebody's been living on the street for 15 years, if somebody's been in and out of the system, or like in your guys' cases where somebody's a bit younger, but they've had trauma in their life. And if we look at adverse childhood experiences studies, we know that when somebody's grown up and experienced a lot of negative activity throughout their life, they're going to have a lot of trauma, and they're not going to trust just the next person that comes along. So our case managers are going to work from this philosophy of recognizing that they're going to meet that person where they're at, and they're going to start building a foundation and a relationship to really start getting to know that person and start building off of what that person identifies that what they need. And this really came out of, in the United States for harm reduction, really came out of syringe exchange programs that started around the AIDS and HIV epidemic in the 1980s. And the folks that were at the table when LEAD started were the folks that said, we need to do harm reduction because we know that we have better outcomes when people build relationships with us. And we've seen that blossom. So we'll touch on that a little more. I just wanted to touch on that in this process. So I'm going to jump back to a new diversion that we have that's included, that we're including today as a third leg of what we do. So one of the newest things that has been identified is a recognition of where we're at in today's criminal legal system. So starting this year, we're actually offering our sites to do a third type of diversion. So we have the arrest diversion, we have the social contact referral. And in Seattle and in jurisdictions around the country, and certainly internationally, if folks want to do not only law enforcement assisted diversion, they can also do let everyone advance with dignity. And this allows for direct community referrals for folks to get into LEAD. And what I mean by that is that this basically takes an opportunity for a community member, whether that's a business owner, a neighborhood resident, or a community-based organization, to be able to refer somebody into LEAD. And the way it basically works is that community member, business leader, or community-based organization would be able to refer that person directly to the project manager. The project manager would work on figuring out what the deal was and ultimately work with the case managers to do outreach. And that is something brand new. We're really proud of what we're doing there, especially in the times we're in, especially in the United States with trying to continue to do police reform. So we think this is really a good key as we move forward. And that's something that we'll love to talk to you guys more about. We just wanted to at least be able to touch on that because that is something new. When it comes to who we divert folks for drug possession, drug sales, sex work, and then just very broadly, crimes driven by addiction, mental illness, poverty, and homelessness. And we work with folks that suffer from substance use disorders, mental illness, poverty, and homelessness. LEAD is not a program. It is really a system change. It recognizes that arrest and prosecution and conviction can actually cause more harm and interfere with lasting behavior change. Arrest and incarceration can further destroy individuals, families, and communities. And we can work without a stick. We don't need to hold something over somebody's head in order to do better. So we're gonna show a quick video. Elsa, I'm gonna stop sharing for a second, and then we will get back to case management with Naja.
And I'm just sharing this clip. Hopefully everyone will be able to see it.
Yep, it's coming up by the looks of things, Elsa.
Brilliant. Okay.
We begin with the new frontier in the war on drugs. It's a pioneering program that gets addicts on the path to recovery instead of putting them in jail, even if they're still using. And tonight, those on the front line show ABC's chief health and medical editor, Dr. Richard Besser, how their new approach makes cities safer for everyone.
In the war on drugs,
short cropped hair, blue jacket, white t-shirt.
the Seattle police are the front line.
This cooker's been used, there's heroin in it.
Every day capturing users hooked on crack cocaine and heroin.
I haven't used it. Doesn't matter, you're possessing it.
But this is not standard police work. These specially trained officers have the power to decide what happens next.
Decisions have been made to not incarcerate, and for the right reason, low-level drug offenders. You can't jail or incarcerate your way out of a problem.
Nationally, we're in the grips of one of the worst heroin epidemics in history. Heroin deaths have skyrocketed. So in Seattle, where heroin has been a problem for decades, fed-up authorities decided to try something new.
Go ahead, grab your stuff, go. We made contact and gave them some options, and we'll see where it goes from there.
Officers Victor Mays and Leslie Mills are part of a first-of-its-kind program called Law Enforcement Assisted Diversion, or LEAD.
You're burned out, you're ready?
A radical new idea for policing that treats drug addiction as a disease, hoping a reduction in crime will follow.
They're not bad people, the people are using, they're being victimized by these drug dealers who are preying on their addictions. Of course they're not going to get better.
This unit is tasked with getting to know users in just one Seattle neighborhood, Belltown.
Because we know all the faces, all the people down here, we're able to do all the other work.
How are we going to assist you to get a better life?
And then the program gives the officers the option of putting low-level drug offenders not into jail.
And you're not shooting at all?
No.
But onto a path to recovery.
He saved me from jumping out my third floor window of my apartment.
They know that if this van stops, something's going to happen. Somebody's going to jail.
Or somebody's going to be helped.
How are you doing? How are things going?
Users who join LEAD get a counselor, one who doesn't judge. Naja Morris works together with the cops to make sure users get any kind of support they need.
You okay?
Yeah, just my hand's sore.
Helping them feel part of society again by finding them housing and medical care, even if they continue using drugs. Tarina James is one of Naja's clients.
That'll work. Yeah, I can just put this behind my ear.
I'm going to work just as hard for you if you've decided that you're not ready to stop using drugs because you're not at that point. We work for them and show up for them, and eventually they decide they're going to work and show up for themselves.
And put that right there at the step right here.
Before LEAD, this is one of the places Tarina lived.
Over these 30 years, what drugs have you used?
Heroin, cocaine, methamphetamine, weed.
Pills.
Her hand badly injured from shooting heroin. She tells me she first tried the drug at just 17, after the death of her one-year-old son.
It took all the pain, the sorrow, the sadness. Everything just went away, and I didn't feel nothing. I was numb.
She was hooked, giving birth to her second child, Deanna, while high. Her daughter growing up knowing something wasn't right.
When I first found out, I was a teenager with my mother, and she just told me. And I didn't understand. I did, but I didn't. I was just stop. Just fix it. Why can't you fix it? And the reality is, it doesn't work that way. It doesn't just fix.
So this is one of the main places that I slept.
Is that as low as it got?
Yeah, I'd say this was the breaking point for me. And that's why that day I went ahead and said, I want some help.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Last year, arrested on a drug charge, the cops gave her a chance to join LEAD.
LEAD put me here in January.
Nadja set her up here in this motel, far from her drug corners downtown.
So this sure beats where you were sleeping.
Oh, yes. This is the real Trina right here. This is the person that I've always been. I was the happy mom, you know, happy wife. Getting back to myself, it's still a little bit of a struggle and a little bit of road ahead of me, you know, to get there. But I will get there again. This is an area where they come to use.
But in this city, where traces of the epidemic line the streets.
Yeah. Oh, here's syringes over here. A whole bunch of syringes.
Temptation is everywhere.
If you felt you needed a hit to get high right now, how long would it take you?
About 5 seconds.
5 seconds?
Yeah.
She says she can tell you anything.
She can. She doesn't lie because there's no reason to. She doesn't lie because there's no punishment. She doesn't lie because there's not going to be a hammer if she does. So she can tell me the truth.
In the 4 years since the LEAD program began, overall drug crime here in Belltown has dropped. And LEAD clients are 34 to 58% less likely than other addicts to commit new crimes to support their habit. Anything from shoplifting to breaking into cars. And it's being replicated throughout the country.
It's about preventing crime. And it isn't that that individual is the problem. It's that they're the ones that are taking up your 911 service calls. They're the ones in your hospitals. They're the ones in your treatment beds. So you have to look at each individual and find out, why are you here? Why do you remain here?
I think there's somebody underneath the car at the very end.
Back on patrol, the cops find a 21-year-old.
Hey, partner. Hi. Seattle Police.
High and disoriented.
Are you okay?
Turns out he is already in the LEAD program. Leslie tries to convince him to get back on track.
Come and see me. Okay?
Addiction is powerful. And some users, even if they're in LEAD, just aren't ready for change.
I get what I put in. If I really want something to work for me with LEAD, then I have to work at it.
If I left it open-ended, I saw something spark in him. If I were a betting man, I would say that I think it's going to come.
Roll your wrist out.
Roll your wrist.
But not everyone is eligible, and most violent offenders with felony convictions are not chosen for LEAD.
Turn to me.
Like this man, just released from prison this morning. He's allegedly violated the terms of his probation.
You can see residue inside this.
Drinking alcohol and carrying drug paraphernalia.
But I have to.
Can you help me?
Yes, I can.
Will you help me?
Yes,
please?
I will. Yeah, I will. Listen, you're going to have to go to jail on this violation. We've been down this road with him. Am I going to take another chance on him, and so is Chad? Yeah, we are. I'm so tired of calling your dad because he gets mad every time I call him. But I have to weigh in that the people that are out there in the community, the one peaceful thing that we know about is that he's going to jail tonight.
Drug addiction's I've lost everything.
It's really tough, especially with the guys that are chronically depressed, that you're having the same conversation over and over and over and over, and you're just beating your head against the wall.
Hey. Hey, Naja, how you doing?
How's it going?
The next time we see Tarina, she's clearly high. Barely able to keep her head up, almost falling asleep in her chair.
So you definitely took your pain medicine this morning?
I took something, but not the pain medicine. I don't have it anymore. I gotta get on the methadone. I've got some.
She's tried methadone before. She tells Nadja she's desperate to stay clean.
Oh my goodness. She's having a little bit of a hard day today.
But Nadja doesn't give up on her. This is all part of the program.
It's just a matter of hanging in there with them, staying in communication, and just letting her go through her own process and just being there.
What do you say to someone who says, I don't want my tax dollars providing support to someone who continues to use illegal drugs?
The amount of money it takes to funnel the addicts through the system simply for being addicted is way more, and is actually costing taxpayers more dollars than what this program is costing to give them an opportunity to actually do something different with their life than sit in a prison cell or a jail cell.
We check in a few months later. Tarina is now on methadone and working to rebuild the relationship with her daughter.
That's great. And I tell her quite frequently, I forgive you. I wish she just saw how wonderful she really is, because I think the day that she does see it is the day that she'll be all right.
For Nightline, I'm Dr. Richard Besser, Seattle, Washington.
Thank
So I'll hand over to you now, Jen.
Thank you. So I haven't seen that piece in a while. There's another piece, but I was just reflecting and thinking about how much, there's another piece with Tarina in it. I think we'll send that out to you guys. It goes into depth in a different way, but I just want to update you. At the time that that was shot about 4 years ago, actually almost exactly 4 years ago, it was around, it got released like October 4th of 2016. Tarina was waiting to get on methadone. Her and her daughter had a pretty shaky relationship. She wasn't able, she has one grandchild, her granddaughter. She was not able to be alone with her granddaughter because of her use. And I am pleased to say that as of about 2.5 years ago, Tarina is, her hand is healed. She's off methadone, and she's a full-time staff, a very valuable, essential piece of the staff at the Public Defender Association. She is accounting assistant and accounts management, and she helps assist the management of a multi-million-dollar agency with over 65 staff right now. And she's doing wonderful. She has her granddaughter full-time, primarily because her granddaughter needed other support that the mom wasn't able to do at the time. And she wanted her granddaughter to go to a specific school that can help with her recent diagnosis of ADHD and some other learning disabilities, that she was actually the one to call out and notice in her granddaughter that her mother wasn't able to notice. So she's a perfect example of why it's important that people not be given up on, and that people that are chronically struggling with homelessness and addiction have the opportunity to move in this continuum through a harm reduction philosophy and get clean and do what they feel like they need to do for themselves, so that they don't have to be removed from the society, so they don't have to miss out on their families, so they don't have to sit in a jail cell and watch their life go by. As you hear her decision to go to treatment, she very clearly articulated, I want to get back to myself. I want to get on methadone. That was Tarina's plan. So that was my plan along with Tarina. If Tarina had ever decided she wanted to do something different, then I would have rode with Tarina on whatever that was. But at the same time, part of harm reduction philosophy is, although you let that person decide what they want to do, during that travel and during that process, you still kind of call to their attention roadblocks or warning signs, right? We still have a responsibility to help that person navigate a very scary and complicated world. There's a lot of people that are typically functioning, I just use that because it's the easiest way to state this, that have a hard time applying for jobs, figuring out Social Security benefits, getting other things, getting veterans benefits. And so with the harm reduction philosophy, what we're really, really looking at is, what does this person need and what does this person say they need that would help them to do better today, that reduce their harm, and that tomorrow somehow they will be moving along the path of better health, better well-being, and how they will be moving along the path to helping their society and the community and public be safer because they've shifted their behavior. So when we talk about harm reduction, we talk a little bit about, I spoke with this about a little bit, participant identified and driven. So it took Tarina quite a while to come see me or to trust the program. It took us about 1.5 years to get to the point you saw. That was 2 or 3 episodes of methadone attempts that failed. That was a few episodes of disappearing for a couple of months. So what we do, and if you heard me state in that interview as well as her, I'm just there. I just stay there. I am the constant, and there's nothing she can do to make me disappointed in her or to make me drop her or feel like she no longer deserves this relationship and this opportunity. And that's super important. It's super important to understand with harm reduction, the approach is not based on outcomes. It's not based on sobriety. It's not based on a stick or a hammer. It really is based on what you feel like. You really is based on just sitting with the person, building a relationship with the person, being that individual that when they're ready for change, whatever that change looks like to them, you want to be that person that they come and talk to. And then another important component is peer outreach and counseling and trauma-informed care. One thing about harm reduction is that you want to make sure that you go to the people. One thing that can create harm for folks is being pushed through the system and having to come into clinical settings and offices again and again and again. What we need to understand is for folks that have a lot of trauma, that's very triggering. Having to walk into a building with white walls and see people behind a glass and sit across a desk from someone and be on their turf and be in their environment, for folks that have in their minds failed time and time again, or they might not feel comfortable in a place where it's very formal. They might feel like they don't look a certain way or they smell a certain way. So what we do to try to reach people and meet them where they're at is go out and meet people in the field. Very street-based oriented. We go under bridges, we go under squats. If there's ever a place where we feel like it's unsafe, we might call law enforcement and ask them just to keep an eye out for us, or we ask one of our peers or coworkers to come with us if we're looking for someone. We spoke with this earlier, specially tailored interventions. It has been the case that someone has come in and told me they don't ever plan on stopping using their drugs. But what they would really like to stop using is maybe they don't want to stop using alcohol or marijuana. But what they would really want to stop using is heroin. So they go and get on methadone. And then they're like, but I really want housing. So we find a housing first program for them. And then they're like, well, maybe I want housing, but maybe I also want to get visits back with my daughter. So there might be someone that's still using marijuana, is on methadone, we find housing for, and we get them their Social Security or their VA benefits, and that for them is their success. Like for someone, that is their success. And our success is whatever reduces harm and moves a person closer to health and well-being. And we also want to look at cultural competency and what it looks like to really meet people where they are and to look at who that person is in front of you. So it's important to also have a multifaceted team when possible, because sometimes women only want to work with women because of traumas that happen on the street. Sometimes people of color or BIPOC folks, which is in America, that's Black Indigenous people of color, because I have to remember I'm across the pond right now. So here that means Black Indigenous people of color, if you ever do hear that terminology. It used to just be POC, but there was a problem because POC is so inclusive that there started to be a misunderstanding about who that included. So that's how that terminology came. But just being culturally competent in terms of race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender expression, all those things are super important to be able to think about how you're going to show up for folks. Next slide, Brendan. So we talked about this. So case management, it's slow and steady. These services are not contingent on a pass fail. They're not contingent on you didn't do this, so you're bad, or you committed a new crime, so I'm kicking you out. It is ludicrous to think that you kick someone out for doing an activity that made them eligible to be in your program, right? And we also consider who's actually safer and how is it actually helpful to kick someone out of a program because they committed another crime. They're not going to get any more help. They now have a person that could have been with them is now gone. They're no longer going to be able to have access to services, and the police are still going to have to deal with them. So basically you just remove them from any possible safety net or fail safe that was there. And so you're just putting that person back at square one, and oftentimes before square one, because again, they've been rejected, they've been kicked out of something, and all you're doing is re-traumatizing them and telling them again that they're bad and they're not worth it. Again, it's not a directed treatment approach. This isn't, come on, I want you to come into this program so you can get into treatment. This is, come on, I would love to work with you and I would love to build a relationship with you and figure out what I can do to help you and help you reach a goal that is important to you. So again, this isn't directed treatment. This isn't abstinence-based or anything like that. This is rooted in evidence of change, rooted in evidence of stages of change, client-directed and long-term case management. People stay in this program for as long as they need. We have people that came in for 9 months, got on methadone, got their Social Security, got housing, and we never saw them again. right? We have people that came in and maybe went and moved to a family member state in another state and we never saw them. We also have people that have been in the program for 9 years. And so the 9 years didn't look just like a straight line. The 9 years looked like some great change. And then it could have been that some bad things happened. Just like in our life, right? We can have really good times and then bad things can happen where things fall off. Maybe we have a death in the family, maybe our house burns down, maybe we lose our job. So the reason we keep people in as long as they need to be in is because we don't believe that anyone who's been through this many things just has a point where they're just ready to be on their own. We feel like they always are going to need to have support, and we want to be there. So even if they're kind of like in an inactive status, we want to be able to loop them back in as necessary. So when we have people come into the program, we just do a biopsychosocial intake and a release of information. That's the only thing required. After that, they can blow out. But what's important to know is that after people do that first meeting, about 85 to 88%, almost 90% of folks, even after that requirement is done and the charges drop, they still stay in touch. And this is because they want to. This is because they see that it's a different approach, that this person really cares, that I'm going to be able to drive my plan, and that this is actually going to be something that feels really different. And we do a biopsychosocial intake, and it's not an assessment. This isn't like I'm going to find out what's wrong with you so I can tell you how to fix yourself. This is us asking, who are you? How did you get here? What's important to you? Have you worked before? What are any physical ailments that you have? Is there anything that's going on with you that I should know about? Is there anything you need help with right now? Do you have kids? Do you have a religious community? Are you in touch with your family? Do you have any health conditions that we should talk about or get you a doctor for? So it really, really, really is about the whole person and trying to figure out where we start with them. And again, I said it's field-based, not office-based. Next slide, Brendan. Okay, I'm gonna kick this back over to Brendan.
So yeah, just to thanks, Naja. That was awesome. So it's just important to note that lead can be complicated. It's a lot of the alternative diversion initiatives in the U.S. Tend to be exactly what Naja was saying, the direct to treatment. And I'm not saying that those aren't complicated in trying to find treatment beds, because treatment beds in the U.S. are hard to come by, but they tend to be a one touch and that's it. And lead can be complicated. I know that looking in the chat, I know at least a few people had asked about engagement and about what if somebody keeps offending. So those are operational work group meetings that keep on happening on an every other week basis. Many times that's because individuals do continue to act out, do continue to have problematic behavior, because folks aren't just going to change overnight. But there's a lot of problem solving that goes on there. So with lead, when somebody is diverted and it's an arrest diversion, the police are giving up one arrest and the prosecutor is giving up one prosecution. If somebody reoffends, basically the police have another option. They certainly have an option to not arrest again, or they could move forward and file new charges on that new crime. But like Naja said, we're not going to remove the person from lead. So we're going to problem solve, and we're going to figure out what engagement does that person need, and great case managers like Naja are going to go walk alongside that individual while they have to deal with that charge, to let them know I'm still here for you. Something that participant might never have had before. Somebody that's actually saying, I'm not judging you, I'm here. There's no stigma to the fact that you got rearrested. I'm going to be here for you. What do you need? It is complicated in the fact that this is a multi-agency power sharing commitment. No one owns lead. So when I was chief of police, this was not my initiative. And when we wanted to make changes, I had to remember that I had to go back to the other stakeholders and say, hey, my officers said they would like to be able to change our policy to go from bringing people to the station to doing field-based diversions. Or, we realize that we have a hiccup in the fact that we're not diverting people who have warrants, and it's creating an issue with racial disparities. We're not able to make a dent in racial disparities as much, because when we look at our data, there's a difference and we want to make a change. I couldn't just make that change on my own. I needed the stakeholders, and we needed to make that decision together. So it's a really power sharing formula that you need to stand by, and it's different because most of us just answer to ourselves. We don't have to answer to the whole group. Fidelity to the lead model is a key to successful replication, and because we're not a cookie cutter program, Fidelity looks at our core principles. It doesn't look at, hey, here's the A to Z, do A to Z and you're perfectly fine, because we recognize that what works in one jurisdiction and the rules and regulations in that one jurisdiction are different in each. To give you all an example, the United States has way too many jurisdictions. So policing alone in the United States, there are 18,000 police agencies in this country. So we would ultimately, if there was going to be lead in every jurisdiction, it would be in 18,000 jurisdictions. It's crazy. There's way too many. The laws, certainly while there's federal laws in the US, in each of the 50 states, there's individual law books. And then in each of the jurisdictions within those states, there are sometimes local legislation that things have to go by. So we bring those core principles, pre-arrest, upstream, before this goes before the court, harm reduction, case management based on harm reduction. We go based on those core principles. And then, one of the things we've really recognized that is really needed is a strong and independent project manager that oversees the day-to-day operations, that answers to the complete policy group, but doesn't answer to one of those folks. They answer to everybody, and that they're there recognizing that they're there to improve, to make sure lead is operating and not just one of those stakeholders is getting all of the good press. So I'm going to go through this real quick, make sure you guys have this, but when we look at our evaluations, we have some really strong evaluations. And for law enforcement, like the number one thing for me was realizing a 58% reduction in rearrest. So when lead started in Seattle, there was a really good opportunity for evaluation, because on one day, which were called green light days, there were case managers that were available and diversions happened. On the next day, they were called red light days because there were no case managers available. So those same officers in that same neighborhood, when they came across somebody who would have been eligible for a lead, they didn't have the option for lead, so they would make an arrest. So they had these really good comparable groups, and so this 58% reduction in recidivism. So we know that it works for public safety. We know that it works for increasing people's income. We know that it decreased felonies. So we know we have really good stuff. And those are some of those more, the lead group compared to the control group. But some of the things that, we look at justice costs. We also know that there's a huge cost savings when we look at the medical system here. I know the medical system for you guys is much different. For us, the medical system is all over the map, and we know that we ultimately have some changes. One other thing that I just put the map up so you guys can see where we are in the US. But one of the evaluations that's not touched on in here is relationship built. And there are two evaluations in Seattle that I think are really important. And one was participant driven, and it was about why participants stayed involved. And those participants talked about how respect and dignity really kept them involved in lead and wanting to engage. Because for the first time ever, many of them had been through other diversion programs. Some of them had been through things like drug court. And they always felt like, number one, they had no say in what they were doing as part of those diversion programs. And number two, they felt like there was always this stigma attached and they were being judged. And they felt like with lead, they had case managers that listened to them, that didn't tell them what to do, that didn't judge them, and that they could tell those case managers anything and that they didn't get judged. Just like you saw with Tarina, who was just this fantastic human being that I've gotten to know through working with PDA now, coming in to see Naja, and in the state she was in, and Naja just being like, no problem, sit down, what do we got to do? So the participants being like, no, this was a different program. This was a different thing, that I had a person that actually believed in me and didn't judge me. So that was the first part. But the second part was the connection to law enforcement from participants. We have a real problem. Internationally, we have a problem, but especially here in the United States, we have a problem. And we have a specific problem, especially with communities of color in the United States. So to know that participants that are in lead have a better outlook on police, and know that for the first time in many ways that they all of a sudden see the police as being there to actually help them, something that every police officer that I've ever hired, that was the reason why they said they wanted to be a police officer. to know that the participants have looked now at the police as somebody that's there to actually benefit them, that have now said that, hey, before I got the opportunity to come into lead and actually get the help that was what I needed, not arrest, that I now look at the police as being there for me, to benefit me, to know there's that turnaround and to recognize what that means, and what that means to improve police community relations, and to know that lead allows us to listen to the community and do something that the community wants us to do. That's a major driver for a police administrator, for somebody who's trying to make sure that we're improving police community relationships and we're giving the communities at the table. So the other question that I saw that was in the chat was about on that policy coordinating group. Yes, civil rights folks should be on that policy coordinating group. And if you can get folks that lived experience that can sit on that, not only the policy coordinating group, but the operation work group, that is the best thing you can do. We should listen to as many people as we absolutely can. So I'm gonna stop there. I'll stop sharing, and I guess we can, Nathan, I will kick it back over to you, and we want to make sure we left plenty of time to chat.
Yeah, thanks very much, Brendan. Thanks, Naja. That's just really thought-provoking, really interesting. I can see we've got loads of questions coming up. I think as we I do want to do another poll, I think, Elsa, that we've got. But just before I do that, I'd like to just give like a quick reflection of my own. Some of the things that just struck me about what you said and that sort of stuck with me were, you know, this isn't a program, it's not an approach, it's the whole system change. This is something that you're not just looking to implement a service, you're doing something quite different. That comment at the end there about the kind of non-judgmental service, something that's empathetic. I mean, when we've been talking to our lived experience forums about for a different thing, but probation supervision, they've often reflected on good experiences. They've said they were empathetic, they understood me, they were willing to meet me where I was. And that was the other bit that really resonates with a lot of what we hear from our lived experience forums around meeting people where they're at. And I think, Naja, you said literally and figuratively, you know, change takes time, it can be incremental, and actually maybe that incremental change is more long lasting than that short, sharp shock. Actually, it isn't just necessarily like you need to do something within 4 weeks or 3 months. It could take a long time. The peer involving aspect of what you talked about is very close to our hearts, and it's really interesting to hear that the feedback from people on the program about what impact that might have. And I think there are some questions about that as well, about to what extent that's really embedded in the service. Clearly, the evidence hits you, doesn't it? The fact that you guys have been able to do a randomized control trial within the implementation of this, you've got data, you've got some pretty compelling stats there, don't you? So, I mean, I think that is definitely one of the things that hit us at Revolving Doors. We love evidence, and we love robust evidence, and we were really interested to see that and unpick that, and I'm sure there'll be some questions on that as well. But the other thing I wanted to mention was, and maybe this is like, I could kick off with a question as well, and then we can launch the poll after that. But I was kind of really interested in cultural barriers in implementing something like this. Brendan, you've come from a police background. There must be lots of cultural barriers about doing something that looks a bit like all carrot, no stick. And I suppose in an age and a culture when we talk a lot about, I suppose, being tough on crime, maybe in your context, a bit of a kind of law and order agenda. I was looking at a map of yours. It doesn't look like you're just restricted to blue states, so like, and we've been having some conversations with some politicians in our country about how do you keep a service that does sound like, all carrot, no stick, and you've described it yourself in almost those exact same terms, become and remain politically acceptable. I wonder if you have a quick reflection on that. Maybe Naja, could I go to you first about that kind of, what does that look like to you? Oh, you're on mute. You're on mute. The joy. I get to say
thanks for noticing that I'm on mute, and thanks for noticing by looking at the map that we are in a very wide array of locations. Like, we are in South Carolina, which is a very, very red area which for folks who aren't familiar is more of a conservative, way more conservative, all the way to places like California, LA, which tends to be much more liberal, and everything in between. So what we do is the same way we speak about our case managers meeting participants where they are, we as technical assistance providers and the supporters of LEAD, we meet sites where they are. So outside of the core tenets of LEAD, like harm reduction, not compliance-based, people don't get kicked out, and having it be a collaboration, and having that be directed treatment, we are really flexible around how people need to set up a LEAD program that makes sense for their environment, for their political situation and circumstances, and culturally. So there are some places that are very small, where the town or the city they're in is only several thousand people. And how the outreach looks, how the police participate in the outreach might actually look different. They actually might roll a little more on the side of and along with the case manager, because they know everyone in the community, because it's like a small town feel, all the way to a place like LA, which is the largest county in all of the United States. And so they have a different dynamic. And so we really do work with people. And like we were speaking of, Brendan spoke of the let everyone advance with dignity, the continuum that we're moving to community referrals and moving to allowing folks to decenter if needed, police from being the gatekeepers to people getting in. In some places that would never work. In some places it's a very strong police culture and there's not an issue, and they're not seeing or even aware of or ready to understand or respond to the disparities in policing that's happening. So we meet them where they are and let them keep police in that place. And if when the shift needs to happen, there's already this alternative that we can help them kind of transition to where they might do both. They might accept community referrals and they might accept police referrals. So what we really try to do is keep an open mind, understand that there's different politics and different needs across the country. Our main goal is that we know LEAD works, and we want to make sure that the people that get it need it. We're not going to get into political entanglements with folks around things. And there's not always every place that we go where people agree with us. There are places we go where they still can't talk about needle exchange, where they still don't understand why methadone works and they still consider it as bad as heroin. And they don't understand why going in once a day and being able to get weaned off when you're ready is much better than spending all day, every day committing crimes trying to get high. And so there's just there is a very wide array of understanding. And we are clear when we move into a place that we're sometimes clear about what we're stepping into, but sometimes we're not. And we just have to kind of have the very, calm pace, it's okay, this is great. So it can be a little complicated, but we work it out. We really want LEAD to be everywhere, and we want LEAD within those, parameters of our core principles. We really want to get LEAD as many places as possible. And then when we get in there, we kind of help people move along. So these places, I shall say no names, started out where they were a very small town, very rural, very insular. And they wanted to only divert people who had 2 grams or less of an opioid. That's it. No other charges. That was it. And we were like, okay. But inside we were like, that's not going to work, because people are carrying just for personal use. And what about all the other crimes? But we didn't push back. We said that, okay, that's a good place to start. We believe that your slowest partner. So if your slowest partner says 2 grams and the other partner says 5, the partner that wants 5 has to start with 2, because everyone needs to kind of be on this path together as a partnership. So we were thinking ourselves when we left, that's not going to work. We're going to work with them and they're going to eventually open it up. So within 6 months, they opened it. 6 to 9 months, they added more grams. And within a year to 12 to 15 months, they added more drugs and more charges. So what they did was similar to how we work with our participants. We let them move at the rate and the pace, and then it made sense for them, but we were there. So when they said, hey, this isn't working, we're not getting anyone, we said, okay, well, why do you think that is? We use a little motivational interviewing with them. Well, I don't know. It seems like everybody we stop, they have a warrant, or, they have an open case, and we have those as exclusionary. Well, have you thought about maybe not making that exclusionary and thinking about how that could look and why you might want to include those people? So we do the same thing with sites. I know that was, excuse me, a long answer, but that's how we work with places that are very different. Yeah, and Brendan probably has
it's really interesting
law enforcement perspective about that, because it's very different from a law enforcement perspective around the country, especially with, as you guys know, in America, we're going through a huge police reform movement right now. So it has actually intensified, if that's even possible. Brendan, do you have anything to add about that?
Yeah, for law enforcement, this is a huge philosophical change. So like when we did this in Albany, we did it because we needed to repair the relationship we had with our community. For years, we were an occupying force in the city that thought we could just provide police services and we could tell everybody what public safety was. And no matter how often we rolled out graphs and charts to show that crime was down, people said they didn't feel safe, and they didn't feel safe because they didn't have a relationship with us. So as we started to actually work with the community and realize that we were creating more harm and more trauma by, kicking down doors and continuing the war on drugs, we realized we needed to change things. And for myself as a police administrator, as we were going to change things, I needed to make sure that every officer understood what that philosophical change was and why we were doing it. So they realized that, yeah, LEAD was one of the avenues we were using to get there. And they needed to recognize that we no longer cared about arrests, that like we cared about getting people help and getting them better. And that was not only getting people better, but that was also decreasing crime. So it was really important to make that shift. We've had like a number of different issues that have come up over the past 5 to 10 years in the US, and certainly around the rest of the world as well, that have driven the need for diversion. One of the things that's happened certainly is the opiate crisis. So a lot of folks have instituted LEAD because of the opiate crisis, because they know it's a better way. Now, depending on what community we're in and we start talking about that, folks will say, well, geez, it's nice that we're doing that, when the folks being affected the most are white people, and now all of a sudden you're going to divert folks because it's white suburban kids that are overdosing as opposed to the crack epidemic, which I was around dealing with. When I talked to my community in Albany, which a lot of the folks that we implemented LEAD for was because we were listening to people of color and realizing what we had done for the war on drugs, especially around crack. So when we go into communities, like we make sure that we do stick by our core principles. So when we talk about LEAD, it's like, yeah, if you want to implement LEAD because of the opiate crisis, because of the issues you have, that's great. We'll do that. We'll help you do that. But we're going to also stick by our core principles, and we're going to talk about racial disparity, and we're going to make sure we address what the issues are happening around the country. And we do that delicately. So like Naja said, we go places where syringe exchange is still illegal based on state law. But we still talk about the fact that, hey, this is one of the foundational principles of LEAD is harm reduction. And you need to know why we're doing harm reduction. It's the basis for it, and it's why it works. So there is a bit of a juggling act for us, but we do it in a manner where people walk away and they appreciate it. The jurisdiction that Naja mentioned about that only wanted to do the 2 grams of opiates, when we did the training for the police officers, it was the police officers that were like, this is ridiculous. Why are we only doing this charge? So, our recommendation back to those officers were like, this is what your department and what the prosecuting attorney have agreed upon. My suggestion is you guys talk to your bosses and tell them you want to do something more than just the 2 grams of the opiate. And that's the most powerful thing you can do. So it's just it's an interesting shift. We've seen with the most recent police reform, we've seen a pushback. So we've seen people want to get back to more law and order, and we're kind of like, hey, stop. Yes, there's a lot of friction going on in the community right now, but this pushback for law and order, that's a slippery slope of where folks are going. We've been there before. It didn't all work. So let's all keep in mind that we've actually made a lot of really good progress. The philosophical shift has worked. Let's make sure we continue to go down that road.
It's really interesting, guys. Thanks very much. I've definitely exhausted my chair's privilege of asking questions, but that was a very fulsome answer. So thank you very much. But you did touch on something there around kind of race and disparity and dealing with different kinds of issues. So Elsa, that might be a nice trigger for our poll, actually. Because obviously we have the same sorts of issues that you have there in terms of overrepresentation. And we also see a very low level, well, we've got very poor stats on, you know, who's actually being diverted in this country, but we don't see very many people, well, in your terms, like indigenous people of color getting diverted, and we don't see a lot of black people getting diverted. So Elsa, have you got that poll ready to roll? Should we throw it up?
Yeah, I will just launch that. And we just had a few comments that not everyone could see the results. So once I've finished polling, if you read out those results, just so I think some people were having a few problems.
So rather than just saying it's interesting. Okay, yeah. So this poll question, so to what extent do you agree with this statement? The rate of diversion for each ethnic group should be proportionate to the rate of arrests. So by that we mean the more people from a different ethnic background that you arrest, you should be looking to proportionately divert that percentage as well. Right, let's see. How are we doing? Is this one a bit more of a head scratcher, Elsa, or are they coming in thick and fast?
It's coming in slowly, but that might be my Wi-Fi. So I think, oh no, here we are. Yeah, they're coming in. I'll just give it a few more seconds.
Yeah, let's give it a few more seconds, and then we'll have a look at that, and I'll read out the answers.
Okay.
Right.
I will bring
that should be long enough for people.
That should be long enough. I will end polling.
Yeah.
And I will share results.
Thanks, okay, brilliant. Strongly agree. Okay, right. For those who can't see it, 44% strongly agree with the statement that it should be proportionate. 42% somewhat agree, and 14% somewhat disagree. No one strongly disagrees. So quite an interesting preference there to actually looking at proportionately based on the rate of arrest to divert at the same sort of rate. So thanks, Elsa. Let's close that down.